Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This is the 5th episode of the story, What If Naruto Was in a Modern World, in which Hinata was barely exposed to Naruto's constant belief in himself. Now in her mid-20s, she meets him again and discovers a crack in her careful wall of Hyuga perfection. To show your support, like and subscribe. Let's get this show going. Hinata didn't think this particular thing would happen today when she got into the office, leaving Naruto behind in her home to overlook and begin her private garden. Most of her home was going to have to be renovated to accommodate her request, but she was prepared for the costs and the headaches. Plus, he had been very insistent that she leave, something about the noise, dust and the amount of people in the home. To be completely honest, Hinata was entirely unaware of the fact that Naruto didn't want his men to ogle her while she went about her day. In his dignified opinion, that package was his and his alone. Jiraiya had often said that he wasn't good at sharing and that stubborn streak hadn't disappeared over the years. Now, the particular problem she was facing developed when she opened her big mouth and asked advice on her relationship and how far it should be progressing. The thing is, Hinata was still very virginal in the ways of love, having never really traveled that particular path in her life, let alone know when it was okay to strip down to her birthday suit and pull a Venus de Milo on her childhood crush. It wasn't improving matters considering Ero Hinata was having a field day inside her mind. Scenarios were rabid, such as leaving some edible pandies on his pillows, stripping to her skimis and laying on his bed with chocolate lotion lathered up over her breasts, enticing him with a mirror-practiced come-hither look that would melt him on the spot, and so on. Well, she hoped it did improve. So far, it was confirmed by Ero Hinata that she looked constipated or excessively angry when she sneak-attacked her sexy gaze on her bedroom mirror. She assumed it would be more natural once she was face-to-face with him in the right situation. Or so she tried to convince herself. She could almost hear the sex-starved personality snort indignantly at her feeble attempt to think she was some sexy beast, as Naruto had casually teased once. The most daring fantasy, which her perverted counterfeit self had mustered up in a lust-induced delusion, was a scene where she would slip inside the shower while he was innocently washing and just go for the kill, but her pride had frozen her lust in its tracks. The heiress was scandalized, no, traumatized, by the erotic scenarios strolling casually through the young woman's mind. Was this honestly normal after such a short time of dating a man? It couldn't be, she thought with a sigh. Didn't couples have some kind of book or rituals to follow on the proper times to do things? Ero Hinata gleefully announced to her that, no, there is no such thing, and to stop being such a prude and take him already. That was crude, and very crass if she did dare say so herself. Hinata couldn't rely on that particular voice in her head, it had far too much influence on her lately and she was worried she was being led in the wrong direction. Without a moment's hesitation, she decided that she couldn't trust herself. She needed help outside of her obviously warped logic and looked for salvation elsewhere. But now, she was regretting it. Nothing was worth this torture. Oh, he's been thinking about it, no doubt in my mind, Sakura mumbled through her mouthful of strawberry salad. Hinata blinked while Hanabi merely nodded in agreement, as though it was the most obvious thing. Now, the question is, are you? Hanabi pointed at her sister with a fork full of lasagna. Hinata huffed and blushed a deep crimson that amused Sakura to no end. To Sakura's surprise, Naruto had uncovered a woman under all those layers of hard ass and was slowly turning her back into someone she recognized. The strawberry blonde woman shook her head while the pale-eyed girl tried to recover a little dignity. It was obvious to anyone that Hinata had been struggling lately with the idea of taking her lover to the next step. Naruto was practically sex on wheels lately and exuding pheromones to make any girl go swirlied. Guess that's what happens when a boy is in love, untouchable equals desirable. It was pretty cute watching her suffer under their teasing. Naruto had been correct in his observation that Hanabi was a force to be reckoned with. She caught on without even a hint and went with it, as was the case here. Oh, quit being such a prude. Hanabi poked her this time, causing bits of sauce to stick to Hinata's blouse. The eldest sister narrowed her eyes dangerously, a warning that would have most people running out of a room, but her sister ignored her with expert ease. "I'm not being a prude," she retorted, slapping the offending utensil away from her. Sakura burst out laughing. It was rare to see her boss so relaxed for once. Hinata had finally crawled out of her hole and was well enough to come to work. Although, she was sure that the girl needed a break from Naruto's intensity. 25 and still a virgin, Hanabi mumbled in disbelief. Hinata gasped and Sakura nearly choked on her olive. "Are you serious? She's so hot-looking." "How is that even possible?" the assistant managed to spit out between painful coughs to clear the item from her throat. "I'm what?" "Sakura, that's, extremely serious. Worst thing is that, I feel sorry for all those contraceptive pills wasted every month." Hanabi cut off her sister's rant and crossed her arms in thought. "I'm sure she's been diligently saving herself, Hanabi." Hinata half shouted in horror. "You know very well I used those to clear up complexion issues I've had since my teen years." "Sure, complexion issues. Let's pretend that's the reason and not the one that rhymes with itch," her sister chirped. Hinata choked oddly and Sakura could only laugh again as the two sisters bickered back and forth over what could and couldn't be revealed at work and in front of their coworkers. "I figured she was into hardcore stuff, like S&M. She's so mean with everyone, it's surprising, to be honest," Ino piped in innocently. While walking by, the heiress watched the blonde stroll away with her mouth agape. Ino turned the corner only to disappear before Hinata could deny the wild assumption. The editor was completely unaffected by the silence she'd thrown the little party into. Hanabi was the first to break the odd silence, bursting with laughter. Sakura tried to continue eating her salad, but couldn't figure out how to open her mouth without laughing, so she just stared at the table and shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Several seconds ticked by. Hinata was at a loss for words when she heard the inevitable. "What's the safety word you use?" Sakura asked, deciding that her curious nature was stronger than her sense of safety. "Oh. My. God. I certainly am not into S&M and there is no safety word." Hinata pressed her palm against her forehead and groaned. This conversation had completely gone out of hand. "It's banana, I bet," Hanabi piped in without missing a beat. Sakura cackled and Hinata slumped in her chair, giving up on having a mature conversation. Her serious query was now being mocked and belittled by her close friends and family. She'd lost total control once more and she could barely keep her blush from expanding as it was. With Naruto, orange would be a better fit, Sakura giggled while Hanabi looked perplexed at the comment. "That guy's got a weird obsession with the color. You never know." Sakura trailed off as Hanabi made an O with her mouth in understanding. Suddenly the younger woman had a strange glint in her eyes that made Hinata brace herself with worry. "She does have all those silk scarves in her dresser." Hanabi smirked. "Oh really?" Sakura drawled out, eyes sparkling with gossipy interest. Hinata was beyond scandalized at this point. This had to stop. "Those are for dressing, not sexing." Hinata shouted quickly without thinking. She gasped and the girls stopped moving in shock. Hinata's vulnerability was becoming apparent, she wasn't used to being barraged like this. "Man, would have paid good money to see Naruto walk in just then," Sakura whined in disappointment. "Sexing? Is that even a word?" She mimicked Naruto's tone almost to perfection. "Agreed, it would have been priceless," Hanabi nodded, "I bet she would have fainted. Just like the good old days." Hinata's assistant sighed with nostalgia. "Can we just please get back on the subject at hand?" Hinata felt like slamming her head onto the desk, she was absolutely miserable. "Right, how to fuck Naruto 101, Sakura said casually before she took another mouthful of lettuce, chewing carefully. Hinata was starting to seriously consider firing her. "You're both adults," Hanabi cut in, she could see her sister was starting to lose her patience. It goes without saying that you move up in intimacy when you're ready. It could take 5 years, it could take 2 hours. Sakura nodded. Plus Naruto's pretty thick with that stuff. You'll need to be real clear on your intent or what you want. She snapped the lid to her container shut, putting it back in her purse. Barney style would be your best bet with him. Barney style? Hinata was confused at the term. Real simple-like, meaning, very direct. And you'll probably have more success with a Hansen approach, if you catch my drift. Sakura couldn't help the grin while wiggling her eyebrows. This was priceless. She didn't know a human could turn that shade of red. She got the drift. Take the initiative. Oh, no 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 no. That was too bold, even for Hinata. It had taken so much effort just to kiss the man, took her ages just to kiss him. How is she supposed to pull that off? Hanabi finished her sister's thought without knowing. Hinata narrowed her eyes dangerously, though she was very curious to hear the answer. What? Are you serious? Sakura ushered her voice in disbelief. Hanabi nodded as Hinata looked away, a little irked that they were reacting this way. Sakura suddenly realized they were dealing with a girl inside the body of a woman in love. This was a bit more complicated. Well. Sakura leaned back against her chair, the creak of the wood distracting Hinata for a moment. That's not something we can really help with. You need to decide for yourself if it's what you want to do, to follow the mood of things and read your partner to see if he's ready for that, too. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you too, but it's not that obvious for me, Hinata quipped dryly. The two girls blinked at the sudden confession. Time to be more direct with these two. Hinata was done taking their light banter. Since it's so obvious to you two, let me start with you, Sakura, she asked, her tone laced dangerously with impatience. With the invisible finger pointed at her, Sakura couldn't look at her boss. Since when had Hinata picked up sarcasm? How did you know you were ready? I need an example to compare my own feeling in this situation. The air had gone cold in the room and Sakura's sense of danger was screaming, answer her or she's going to fire your ass. That's a pretty good question and a very difficult one, was all she could think to say to stall the increasingly irritable woman. Hinata was starting to think she was in a hopeless situation. She could sense the other woman stalling for time. She needed to know if what she had been wanting emotionally was something normal, and warranted the urge to possess Naruto at a sexual level. The real issue was that she wasn't sure how to bring it up without coming across as a complete pervert. What about? Hanabi started only to be cut off by a familiar voice from behind her. You know, love and lust are pretty similar things. Ino appeared out of nowhere again. She slipped her thin-framed glasses from her face to the top of her head and paused next to her boss. Hinata was startled by the unexpected visit and clearly eeped at the woman. The blonde ignored her and continued her speech. 1. Just means more than the other and makes the experience a little bit more euphoric. She put her hand on the heiress's shoulder and smiled at her, which gave Hinata a strange sense of comfort. Sex isn't a pivotal point in a relationship. Lots of people have one-night stands, some even make a living out of sex acts, she continued as the girls turned thoughtful listening to her advice. If you want to jump him, then you're ready. If the thought of it scares the shit out of you, then you're not, he'll understand if he truly cares for you. Crass, but to the point. Ino wasn't one to tiptoe around a subject for too long and the girls had been torturing the poor woman for nearly 2 hours. You could always strike his pressure points if he acts like an asshole and put him into a well-deserved coma, Hanabi suggested, quite nonchalantly. You're not helping, Ino deadpanned. Hanabi shrugged her off. Well, it doesn't scare me, not at all. Hinata calmly said. She'd been in love with him since her childhood, despite the fact that she had promptly forgotten about him. My question still stands. I want to know how one decides if they are ready for that, so Sakura, how did you know for your first time? Ah. Well, things were a little chaotic back then. I was young, he was young, and life seemed far more dramatic and serious than it actually was. She scratched the back of her head and leaned back a little against the chair while trying to recall the moment of her decision. "You did it on a whim?" the heiress asked, quite directly. Sakura blushed. Hinata wasn't off the mark. She was completely dead on. "Ah, well. It's more compel, with Sasuke it was pure love," Ino cut her off again. She would have fucked him 4 ways to Sunday despite the fact that he didn't give her the time of day most of the time. "Ino," the pink-haired woman yelled out in surprise. Hinata wasn't sure who Sasuke was, but she figured it must have been a torrid love affair by how Sakura was shocked into speechlessness. "Oh, stop being so coy, it's no secret." Ino scoffed, ignoring the glares. With her second tryst in the art of sex, it was entirely on a whim, Ino confirmed without skipping a beat. She took complete advantage of Naruto when she was feeling rejected and fucked his brains out because he was available and willing. Sakura's mouth snapped shut. The conversation had just taken a terrible turn, and before she could reach over to choke Ino into silence, the blonde managed to finish her sentence without thinking about the consequences. Poor bastard even knew she was doing him to get back at Sasuke, but he went with it like a big fucking idiot. Sakura groaned, Hinata raised her eyebrows so high they almost disappeared, and Hanabi frowned, as though she was missing something obvious by the way everyone was reacting. I don't know who the biggest moron of the two was, Sakura for being such a heartless cunt and taking advantage of his feelings, or Naruto for forgiving so easily after 6 years with her. Ino just kept babbling. And babbling. There was just no end to it. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that." Sakura cut her off. Ino only rolled her eyes in a whateverlet's-I-sleep-at-night way that infuriated the young woman. "I did have feelings for him. I really did. Not feelings of love, you hypocrite. You only felt like it was more because he confessed to you and you took advantage of his sorry ass after he got out of the hospital." Ino was pointing at the woman, who had shrunk down in her chair. She knew she was right. "The worst part of your charade is that on the night Sasuke left, you were screaming for him to take you with him while he was beating Naruto into a coma." It dawned on all of the ladies, quite suddenly, that the subject at hand was very awkward and completely taboo. Sakura slumped in her seat and sighed while Ino mumbled an apology for bringing up the ghosts of the past and sheepishly looked over to the current love interest of Naruto Uzumaki. Hinata was staring at the floor, repenting for even bringing up the subject. Although curious to hear more on this tidbit of the shrouded past, it had hurt her for some reason, more than she anticipated, but it was from her own doing. She couldn't be upset with their history, and she had to get over the bitterness swimming in the pit of her stomach caused by the fact that, although she had never shared herself with someone, Naruto had already given himself to another woman. That was years ago, Hinata, Sakura tried to reassure her, but it was obvious that Ino's bluntness had done its damage. "He broke up with me when it was obvious to him I was using him, I broke his trust and his heart." Sakura looked at her very seriously. "One thing you can be sure of, Hinata, is that he cares very deeply for you. You can see it right away just by looking at him." Ino's damage was done, Hinata looked unsure. "If you're that worried about taking the next step, you need to talk to him about it. Nothing we say here will reassure you, only he can." Hinata nodded. It was good advice. Regardless of the girl's past with her boyfriend, she decided she needed to speak with Naruto. Tonight, for sure. Naruto stared at his cell phone, and Shino adjusted his dark glasses before clearing his throat to catch his attention. "Sorry to disturb you from the staring contest with your LED screen, but I need to discuss this today." Naruto blinked. "Oh, right. I apologize. Where were we?" Shino narrowed his eyes, but the blonde couldn't see it. There was something unsettling about the entomologist. Maybe it was the long lab coat he wore 24/7, or the sunglasses that glinted ominously when he seemed irritated with his employer. Or maybe it was that one time when Naruto went to the lab to speak with him and found him covered with little beetles, willingly, mind you, and didn't remove them the whole time he was there. Naruto had the heebie-jeebies ever since, but the man was an expert in his field and was his secret weapon in the business. Naruto used insects, friendly ones, to keep the natural balance of his home gardens in perfect shape. What's the plan for this garden? Shino was quick to get to the point, as he disliked being away from his lab longer than he needed to. Did you look over the vegetation we're going to use? Yes, after reviewing the list you provided, I have decided that the best option for this setup is to breed my domesticated coccinellidia as per the norm. Shino looked over the workers, seemingly interested in the skeleton born of Naruto's fruits of labor. I will train Miss Hyuga on the life cycle and needs of the insect to keep the fauna balanced. Those are the ladybugs, right? Naruto didn't know all the fancy names, but he knew his bug specialist's preferences. Yes, if you want to plainly call them that. Shino adjusted his glasses again and Naruto could feel it. He was about to get the speech. Coccinellids are typically predators of Hemiptera, such as aphids and scale insects. Shino pulled a small tube from his pocket where a red insect crawled around in the glass confinement as the entomologist brought the specimen closer to his face in observation. Naruto blinked, not sure if he should be concerned with his lack of surprise when Shino actually yanked out bugs from his pockets. Although, in all honesty, he wouldn't be surprised if he could mind control the things to do his bidding someday, or, he wouldn't put it past him, anyway. They are commonly yellow, orange, or scarlet, with small black spots on their wing covers, black legs, head and antennae. A very large number of coccinellid species are mostly, or entirely, black, gray, or brown and may be difficult for non-entomologists to recognize as coccinellids. Conversely, there are many small beetles that are easily mistaken for coccinellids, such as. The blonde's eyes glazed over. He'd heard this speech a few hundred times already and he was starting to know it by heart. The tortoise beetles. Naruto completed the sentence before Shino could continue, causing the bug specialist to stop speaking. There was an awkward silence between the two men. Sorry, Shino. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Naruto rubbed the back of his head sheepishly, trying to soothe the beast that was dangerously close to being unleashed. There was something creepy about the calm man, almost eerie in his silence and observation of the world. Was the only thing the entomologist managed to reply before Naruto's cell phone rang. Hold that thought. He pointed at his colleague before flipping the phone open. Hello, hotness, he exclaimed with a cheesy grin. Hinata stuttered on the other end of the line. She wasn't quite used to his nicknames just yet and his unpredictability on when he used them made her feel out of sorts. On the other hand, Naruto found it awfully cute the way she didn't know how to react. When will the workers be done for the day? She asked quietly. Naruto raised a brow. Was she that eager to come home? Maybe a couple of hours. Why? I need to talk to you. Oh God. The dreaded words. This only meant negative or horrible things that Naruto knew he needed to carefully tread around. About. I can't say right now, Hinata mumbled. He could hear a load of feminine voices cackling in hilarity, flooding the background. Well, okay. I'll see you in a couple of hours then. Okay. Okay. Naruto frowned. This is awkward. Bye. Naruto flipped the phone off and narrowed his eyes. He wondered what he had done recently to deserve the "we need to talk" speech. He couldn't think of anything offhand, but then again, he was a little thick-headed. Shall I continue or do you wish more private time with your phone? Shino cut off his troubled thinking. The blonde nodded and looked at his phone one last time before putting it away again. As you know, the specimens will have to be kept in a cold temperature to force them into hibernation. I will have to train her on how to make the wings sticky so that they cannot fly about the home outside the garden. Naruto stopped listening. Just what had he done this time? It was barely 10 p.m. and her career was on the brink of destruction. The lamp on Tsunade's desk flickered, casting cold shadows across the wooden desk and various trinkets she kept around to remind herself of her fleeting past. Her gaze lingered on the yellowed picture of her long-dead husband before she shook her head slightly. "What would you do, Jiraiya?" She sighed. The dead couldn't solve her problems, or get her out of them. If it hadn't been for Nara, they would be eyeballs deep in sour pickles. Even with the warnings and the preparations, things were getting ugly really fast. "You're still in deep shit, Blondie." No matter how she looked at it, these rumors were going to kill her chances at re-election this year as well as destroy her well-maintained reputation. She had a lot of skeletons in her closet and they were supposed to be completely out of the public eye. She leaned her elbows against the wood of her desk and crossed her fingers, leaning her chin onto them. She narrowed her eyes at the television, slowly displaying her indiscretions to the citizens of Konoha. Unconfirmed sources report that our treasury had funds siphoned and moved to personal accounts. These accounts are reported to belong to none other than Tsunade Senju, our mayor. It's also been reported that this would not be an unusual move from our mayor, as she has struggled with a severe bout of gambling that nearly bankrupted her almost 13 years ago. She was forced to resign from her prestigious medical appointment with Konoha's neurosurgeon department. Their information was pretty much on target, but she hadn't siphoned the funds, though. That bit was incorrect. Nara had pointed out a few weeks ago that there was something being used through the Uzumaki servers to transfer the funds from the city accounts to an offshore account under her name. It had been a shock to her when they traced it back to Orochimaru, although she couldn't say she was entirely surprised. The man had been trying to take over the city for as long as she could remember. What did amaze her was the complicated thinking that went behind the scheme, even dragging down her godson, Naruto. His father was the undeclared rival to the white-skinned corruptionist. That man just couldn't let go of the past, unwilling to release his grudge and stubbornly let it spread to another generation. "He's dead, you old bitter snake," she spat out, as though her long-lost friend was in the room listening. He could potentially be, she wouldn't put it past him to have her office bugged. So far there was no mention of the funds traveling through Naruto's business. Luckily, he had agreed to play possum at her request, endangering not only his business, but his reputation. She'd make sure he was compensated somehow. At least there was no mention of her drinking habits. She was sure they would link that to her gambling and the disappearing treasury. She was a recovered alcoholic, but once a drinker, you never leave the stigma behind. Always haunted by the need, the feel of release from drinking. She'd kill right now for a large bottle of spiced sake. How would Konoha citizens take on the truth that their hard-working representative was nothing but a low life with a fancy title? Not well, she was sure. She leaned back against her chair and neatly folded her arms behind her head before frowning. Orochimaru could be suspicious of their knowledge, he could know that they were on to him. So they were playing along, letting him think he had the upper hand. She was willing to let her good name slide in the mud, anything to capture this idiot in the throes of his own greed. She flicked to another channel before shutting off the television. Pivoting in the chair, she looked outside her window from the office overlooking the city. The night was clear, silent, and showed no signs of the shitstorm that was about to land at her doorstep in a couple of hours. Her thoughts were disturbed by the simple low ring of her cell. She dug it out of her right blazer pocket and hummed out a greeting. "We're tracking their movements." The man on the other end of the line didn't waste a second. She could hear the click of computer keys. "The news is already on this," she spat out, suddenly feeling helpless against this attack. "We both knew it was going to happen sooner or later. They're leaking the information in a way that's forcing the media to dig deeper into your past." She could almost see him shake his head. Their unseen enemy was crafty. "Best to stay low and roll with it, we need to catch M in the middle of this." She hummed in agreement. Before hearing him add in, "even with outsider help, and all that data he transferred to us, there are lots of maybes," but not enough fuck yes to nail him solid with all the slithering in the accounts. It was true that Nara had provided a lot of valuable information that had given them the advantage, all thanks to the Hyuga subordinate that hacked into the White Snake mainframe of business. Her data downloads had nearly filled in all the gaps, but now they needed to catch them in the act, even if that meant playing bait and victim with the news media and destroying her career. She was willing to do anything to prevent that madman from taking office. Anything. Keep me updated, Yamato. Her phone slid across the desk, the plastic item making an odd sound before coming to a full stop. She eyed the darkness again, gritting her teeth in frustration. How much longer would she suffer under Orochimaru's wish to destroy everything from their past? He wasn't there. Inside her chaotic home, Hinata frowned, wondering where he could have gone considering their conversation. She had made it clear that she needed to speak with him. She shouldn't really be surprised, to be honest, he wasn't one to comply with rules. She spun on her heels after quickly assessing the mess in the living room. She could see the layout of the garden, but she couldn't quite picture what it would look like. She didn't have the head for it, she supposed, hence why she hired Rasengan Landscaping and didn't tackle the project on her own. It wasn't long before she circled around to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee. She sat at the island in the middle of the room and couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence that she once welcomed in her home. Naruto had disrupted her center, corrupted it to the point where she craved his chaos. She eyed the room from side to side and it dawned on her, she was more nervous than she anticipated. The more she analyzed the situation, the more she grew doubtful she could go through with this conversation without an overflow of blood settling on her face. Despite that, there were a few things that bothered her, besides her sudden increase in libido. Why did everyone assume that she wasn't ready? It almost seemed like they thought she was asexual, or something. Why couldn't they understand that it just hadn't been her first priority? To be specific, she just didn't really allow any opportunity to arise. She was a businesswoman. Relationships, at the time, were not something she wanted nor did she think about. She was far too busy. Being busy. She had been pursued before, in fact, many suitors had approached her, but she had refused them all. She excused her behavior with work and perfectionism, but the reality of things was that she couldn't remember how to love during that dark period of time. Her past had been a complete mystery and she had no recollection of a positive love. It didn't help that she'd had it drilled into her for years by her father that love was an inconvenience, a weakness. Little did she know it was only his grief and misguided attempt to protect her that skewed her ability to embrace love and its activities like a normal human being. Now, here she was sitting at her kitchen island, contemplating sex with the help of a warm cup of coffee, debating the ways to broach the embarrassing subject with a man that was not only experienced in the activity, but had mentioned several times that he would go at her pace no matter what. It was irksome that he thought she was some sort of fragile lily of the valley and knew that he would most likely tease her if she outright said, "Let's do it," and shoved him into bed. The potential humiliation and misunderstanding is statistically very high. She could almost hear her cousin Niji speak in his monotone matter-of-fact voice. Ugh. She left her mug on the island and quickly stepped towards her bedroom. She couldn't wait around any longer, she needed to change her ideas or she might just chicken out from all the self-analyzing. She was feeling a little relieved that Naruto wasn't here, she couldn't find that branch of courage she felt earlier that day and it was eating at her. A white piece of paper caught her attention as it fluttered off her door and landed on the floor. She reached for it and frowned, wondering what it was. "Sorry, babe. Driving Shino back. His ride bailed out on him." "Babe." She hummed as she tested the newest nickname inside her head. She squint her eyes and reread the note, the chicken scratch was hard to make out. She smiled at the odd little drawing next to the reason as to why he was not home, it looked like some strange attempt at his face. She could see the 3 whisker marks on each side of the strange circle and some strange spiky hair that reminded her of a cartoon. She shook her head. "Who's Shino?" she mumbled as she crumpled the piece of paper, her mind swirling with unwanted questions before she stepped into her room. She needed to get ready if she was going to make herself clear to the boy, even if it cost her dignity in the process. The sound of feet woke Hinata from her light slumber. She could hear as soft shuffling made its way up the hall and into the kitchen. She blinked slowly, trying to clear the sluggish feeling of an unfinished nap. She focused on the clock to her right and blinked again. The green of the digital timekeeper blinked once as the minute changed. 11:52 p.m. almost midnight. Hinata pushed the covers off while stretching and muffled a squeal that escaped her before she decided to sit up in bed. She heard some sound seeking refuge under her door, and automatically arched a curious eyebrow. The sound was definitively too heavy to be the natural vibe of the house. He's probably just standing there, she mused groggily. Her feet touched the cold floor and she stood unsteadily, fighting the heavy slumber that still itched to drag her back into the comfort of sleep. Yet, she wouldn't let it get the best of her. She had a mission to accomplish tonight. Her eyes focused on the slick dark wood of her door and she stepped forward. The space seemed longer than anticipated, but once across the threshold, she pressed her ear against the wood and listened carefully, wondering if Naruto was still there, or if he had taken off to his room. Hinata. The knock, although soft, was loud and deafening with her temple pressed against the door. The heiress clutched at her ear, stumbling back in surprise from the unexpected apparition of her thought. Without really knowing why, she trapped her gasp with her hands and didn't reply to his query. Must be asleep already. Damn it. She heard him sigh and step away from the threshold of her dark sanctuary. That damn Shino. Why did I agree to go inside? Miserable bugs crawling all over. I hate that place. Hinata strained to catch the rest of his grumbling, but the rant lost its weight as he moved inside the guest room and began preparing for bed. She heard him close his door and her shoulders sagged slightly. You missed your chance, Arrow. Hinata sneered bitterly. Hinata ignored the voice and rubbed her arms absent-mindedly, wondering what to do next. She felt a chill crawl up her spine, and she eyed the bed behind her with a bit of longing. Beyond the warmth of her blankets and its comfort, the room was cold and unwelcoming. I should have opened the door when he knocked, she chastised herself a few minutes later. More alert now, she wondered if Arrow Hinata was being fair with her accusations. Considering all the running around Naruto had done throughout the day, Hinata was certain it wouldn't take long for him to pass out and, consequently, chances were she would have to wait for another opportunity to discuss the possibility of including more activity in their relationship. That wasn't the only thing. It had occurred to her later, after their phone call, that he had misunderstood her meaning when she said she needed to talk to him. As a matter of fact, he sounded like a kicked puppy at the end of their conversation. She was willing to bet the Hyuga fortune on it. She groaned again. She needed to clear the air between them, assure him that it was nothing negative. Yet, despite that urgent need to appease him, there she stood, completely petrified, seemingly afraid that the door would bite her hand off if she dared open it. Hinata then shook her head sharply, barely able to resist the urge to stomp angrily at her indecisiveness. Seriously. What the hell was wrong with her? She was the CEO of a major company. She was strong, confident, and she was never one to back down from any challenge. Why was it that, as soon as she discovered she wanted to ravish Naruto, she became uncharacteristically weird, clumsy, and shy? She couldn't put a sentence together and resorted to stuttering like an idiot. Her memories had unlocked a part of her that she did not understand, and it was beginning to become very cumbersome to her present self. Above anything else, she really needed to get a grip on her clusterfuck of emotions. It wasn't like she was trying to determine how to drown a litter of kittens, she just wanted into his pants, for crying out loud. Coward. Me. Hinata grumbled in disbelief. Yes, you. The words echoed again and again, mocking her. Coward, coward, coward. Arrow. Hinata whispered them in her ear and Hinata only growled at the inner voice. This was the last thing she needed. You blew it, it insisted. Hinata scoffed. No, she did not. There was still plenty of time. Maybe in the morning when he woke up, she could ambush him and he'll push you away like that time when you tried to sneak attack him with that sloppy thing you swear was a kiss, the voice finished for her cynically. Hinata's shoulders sagged, agreeing wholeheartedly. Damn it. Arrow Hinata, 1, Hinata, 0, that little girl she used to be before the accident was returning with a vengeance. Hinata felt betrayed by all these personalities filtering through. Maybe Naruto was right, it wasn't such a far-fetched idea that she was bipolar. What else could it possibly be? Arrow Hinata was having a field day with her emotions, the insecure little girl inside was confusing the hell out of her, and the heiress, who she really needed right now, was nowhere to be found. It was just her luck. Her renowned and unyielding Hyuga confidence couldn't have picked a worse time to take a hike. The black-haired beauty scowled. That troublemaking Arrow Hinata had something to do with her MIA confidence, there was no doubt about it, and whatever it had done with it, that pervert was doing it just to spite her. Yes, that had to be it. Hinata dragged her hands over her face and groaned, a habit she was picking up from her boyfriend. What are you waiting for? The voice taunted again, reveling in her anxiety. Go. It's simple. Open the door, slip into his room and take him. What's stopping you? She could almost feel the voice against her skin, pushing her to her limit. You think you're not good enough for him? Hinata bit her lower lip. Are you afraid to make a fool out yourself? Touché. Ugh. Hinata groaned. Arrow Hinata, 2, Hinata, 0, things were spiraling out of hand quickly and she hated not being in control. The continuous pestering was relentless, almost maddening. She couldn't even find an opening to retort. As soon as she started considering all the things that could possibly go wrong, if she decided to just go in and seduce the clueless blonde, that is, that wicked little voice would cut each of them apart with a very solid and distinct, "You're just making excuses. Get your shit together and just do it." I would if you'd let me, she hissed back venomously. It wasn't very effective, however. It seemed she was immune to her own threats and the voice just kept on truckin'. Oh, for the love of cinnamon rolls, where's your backbone? Hinata huffed and crossed her arms. Stupid question, it was where it was supposed to be. Accessing it was just a little bit more complicated than she thought it was going to be. She walked over to her bed and sat on it, bouncing one of her knees rapidly and impatiently. She could argue with herself all night long but the question remained, how could she possibly take control in something she'd never done before? You're a Hyuga. Act like one. Finally. She sighed, thoroughly relieved. That snarky tone of the heiress crawled to the surface and Hinata scrambled towards it, welcoming it with open arms despite the fact it was teeming with her delusional, perverted self. Hinata couldn't complain, however. Maybe now she could shake that terrible insecurity off. Straightening her back with the aid of whatever little resolve the heiress granted her, a determined expression dawned on her face. She gripped the edge of the mattress, and stilled her bouncing knee. She could do this. As nerve-wracking as it was, she knew she could. She wanted to. Hinata looked at clock on the nightstand and forcefully pushed down the feeling of dread that was once again trying to overwhelm her. 12:15 a.m. She had wasted nearly 30 minutes debating over something she had already decided on 8 hours ago. It was ridiculous, really, but as much as she hated to admit it, Arrow Hinata had nailed it right on the head. The only thing that could potentially stop her was how afraid she was of making a fool out of herself. Yet, the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had very little to worry about in regards to his theoretical rejection of her needs. If anything, Naruto was guaranteed to find it unbearably cute if she acted like. What had he called it? Oh, a nerd while trying to seduce him. Not only that, but not too long ago she discovered that sometimes she didn't even have to say anything. She didn't have to worry about whether she was in control or not. Quite frankly, she was shocked to realize that she secretly reveled being at Naruto's mercy when he lit her up like a flare. As clueless as he tended to be, Naruto could catch right on when she gave him a certain look. What that look was, she really didn't know, but she was determined to figure out what it was exactly. It seemed to get the results she sought quite easily and effectively. In fact, she had good evidence to back up that belief after a particular incident from a few days ago. It all started with a scheduled meeting to discuss the terms of the larger landscaping contract they were still negotiating with Rasengan Landscaping. It had been a little bit unexpected, but it was a lesson she wasn't about to forget anytime soon. Before she became aware she'd even given him that look, he had been all over her like white on rice. Despite her denials, it was exactly what she had secretly yearned for, and the man had delivered. She blushed at the memory, closing her eyes as she recalled the details. She had met with him in his office ahead of time so that they could leave together and meet with Hanabi and Niji. As she watched him unfold his collar and throw the silk tie around his neck, she couldn't help but to smile. She could tell he wasn't very good at it, quite frankly he sucked at it. Several moments went by before she could no longer bear to watch the bright orange tie get the best of him. "That's an interesting way to put on a tie," she commented softly, fighting the mirth in her voice. He looked at her, pouting as she resisted a grin. "You do it, then," he grumbled petulantly. She let her lips stretch into a stunning smile, unable to resist teasing him, giving him a taste of his own medicine for a change. Walking up to him, Hinata took the knot away from his clumsy fingers, untied it, aligned the tie properly, and began anew. At the rate he had been going, the poor tie would have ended up looking like a fancy rope. "Kiba usually ties them for me," he admitted sheepishly. She hummed pensively. "Why didn't you ask him, then?" She watched his Adam's apple bob up and down nervously, and a light blush dusted her cheeks. She wanted to run her fingertips over it. "I wanted to impress you," he mumbled. "Clearly, I'm a man, and a man's supposed to know these things." His shoulders then sagged slightly. "It's my secret shame, I guess." Hinata tried to suppress her smile, but she was failing despite her best efforts. "It's not funny," he complained. "I can never get the order of the knots right." "Yes, I noticed that." Naruto huffed. "You don't even need to wear ties. Where'd you learn to do it?" Hinata suppressed a heated shudder. His eyes studied her every move while she tried to focus on the task at hand, and she could feel his warm breath on her face, soothing her as much as it made her nervous. "My father," she paused, her blush darkening when she noticed him licking his lips. "My father taught me, and God, she really wanted to kiss him. I got a lot of practice with Niji before he started dating Tenten." Naruto raised a brow. "Niji?" "Yes." She bit the inside of her cheek. She seriously had it bad. Even the shape of his quirked eyebrow she found sexy. "The tie. Focus on the tie. Would you believe me if I told you that serious and stiff cousin of mine can't tie a tie save his life either?" "Is that right?" he murmured. His voice was low and husky, and before Hinata could help herself, she bit her lower lip. "Steady. Keep it steady," she coached herself unconsciously, yet, her eyes met his briefly and he grinned cheekily at her. He hadn't missed her stutter, let alone the way she had nibbled her lower lip, and Hinata wanted to kick herself. "It's true," she almost whispered, once again meeting his beautiful eyes. "It's a family farce that it is his destiny to suck at tying a tie." There was a moment of silence before Naruto's low and velvety laughter rang out into the room. She looked up from her task, and for a moment, she was dumbstruck. He was simply gorgeous. The urge to forget the tie was taking over her logic. She wanted to run her hands all over his neck, thread her fingers through that wild hair of his and nibble at those whisker-like scars on his cheeks. The strongest urge, however, the one that made her want to bite her lip and cast aside her self-imposed restrictions, was to freely inhale his scent. Without realizing it, she did just that. She felt Naruto stiffen for a split second, startled. As she pulled away and prepared to execute the last loop on the tie, her eyes met his again, and she stopped midway. The smoldering look he gave her took her breath away. She blushed, understanding his silent request, but couldn't help the way she coyly looked away. Responding to his request just as silently, she released the incomplete knot, allowing her hands to press against his chest. She leaned into him, resting her forehead beneath his chin and breathing him in once again. Naruto nuzzled her hair impulsively, also inhaling her scent as his hands reached for her waist. He nudged his nose against her temple, urging her to look up. When she finally did, he dipped his lips into hers, nibbling them when he felt her shudder. His arms tightened around her. Hinata's hands reached up to fiddle with the hairline resting over the upper portion of his neck, thus giving him even better access, and Naruto, for his part, grunted in approval. With a smile, his lips left hers, his teeth playfully biting at her jawline. They journeyed lower, and she trembled prettily, hardly able to resist him. They nipped and tugged at the flesh of her neck, tormenting her, and Hinata released a feminine groan. She wanted to possess him. A primal need deep down in her belly was screaming for more of his touch. His breath was hot, moist against her skin, and she shuddered when he pressed her against the wall of his office. His hands released her waist and his long fingers reached up to grab her hands. They wrapped themselves around her wrists and he pulled them down, keeping them near her waist. One knee slipped between hers, and before she could take in a full breath, she heard him murmur her name. Like his quiet slow laughter, the sultry sound of his voice invaded her logic and she felt disoriented. Her head thumped against the wall and Naruto looked up for a moment with the same confused look she had, but she dismissed it, shaking her head to reassure him she was fine. He barely had time to register her response before her lips mashed against his in a hungry and demanding kiss. Two could play that game. She could take some control and drive him just as crazy. Naruto obliged, his tongue slipping deeply inside her mouth, and she greedily took it in. Her wrists slipped free from his grasp and she quickly buried her hands in his hair, pulling his face closer and moaning when he shifted position, rubbing against her sex. Fuck. He broke the kiss, his hands grabbing her hips and pressing her against him once more. Hinata could clearly feel his erection nestled there, and without realizing, she forcefully rubbed her own sex against it. She heard him grind his teeth, restraining himself, but it didn't last long. Naruto, she whispered wantonly. His right hand slipped from her hip down to her mid-thigh, and there she felt his fingers slide under the edge of her skirt. He let out a grunt of approval and Hinata opened her eyes. She could feel how bruised her lips were as she locked her gaze with his own. He grinned. The blue of his eyes darkened and the flush on his cheeks grew by the second. Something about you in a skirt, he murmured huskily. He was breathless. She raised a brow, but her curiosity was cut short when she felt his fingers unbutton her dress shirt. Hinata gasped when his lips followed her delicate collar bone down the valley of her breasts, nipping at the edge of her bra covering the mounds of flesh. Naruto, the meeting. Ah! A nip at the skin made her flinch, and he looked up, frowning at her as though she had mentioned something unpleasant. He grabbed at the bra's material with his teeth, pulling it down over the nipple and looked up again. Hinata was red with embarrassment. Don't kill the mood. He grabbed the nipple between his teeth and she stiffened, shocked at the sensation. She squirmed, but it only made him more stubborn. It was obvious with the way he held her in place and flicked his tongue across the supple skin that he wouldn't let her righteousness get in the way. You should come dressed like this more often. He was excessively illogical at this point, and under different circumstances Hinata would have rolled her eyes. There was nothing sexy about being dressed for work. It's only a skirt and a dress shirt. Her words ended in a moan when his hands pulled up her skirt and slipped around to her ass, grabbing the flesh to a near pinch. That's like a double knockout move, Hinata. He dragged out her name, and she narrowed her eyes. She could definitely hear the mischievousness behind it. What? Her mind was buzzing. His assault was making her brain collapse on its own, and her words were reduced to single syllables or, her worst enemy, the lustful moan. "You're so hot in a suit, all I want to do is take you out of it. Don't tell me you have a fetish for suits." Ah! Another nip, this time at her lower lip, and Naruto almost growled at her. "Only if it's you." He squeezed her ass cheeks again, his knee further spreading her stance. Hinata felt heated, almost desperate. Her need pulsed relentlessly, but she couldn't satisfy it. She pulled at his sleeves, wordlessly begging for him to do something since she couldn't articulate the request quickly enough. Lucky for her, he was well on his way to fill her with a new sensation. She immediately got lost in his touch, and if he demanded anything from her, she didn't even notice. Please. She was burning up, letting herself be consumed by his own feverish need. She needed to. She needed to do something about the ache between her legs. Her back arched and her bare breasts pressed against him. Growling, one of Naruto's hands traveled from one of her buttocks and zoned in on the source of her impatience. His fingers momentarily marveled over the soft feel of her panties and then moved in for the kill. Over the fabric of the delicate item, she felt sticky. The material was humid and he smirked. He loved it. Naruto pressed his thumb against the swelling nub hidden under her panties and she bucked, gasping at his touch, but in no way denying him. "Wah," he cut off her question with a deep, searing kiss. His index stroked her gently at first, but the tingling persisted and she squirmed impatiently. He pressed harder, stilling her with something she'd never experienced with someone else before. Maybe it was because of just how turned on she was, but if anyone asked her at that very instant, she would admit that his touch was more effective than hers. It was hard to believe, but she could actually feel it with the way the tingling gradually turned into a pulse at a faster rate than she was accustomed to, even if his fingers continued moving at a slow pace. How unfair. Realizing how easily addicted she could become to him, Hinata felt her hips moving to counter the stroke, and her hands frantically grabbed at his shoulders, whimpering when he changed the stroke to a circling motion. "Punishment," he mumbled. He increased the speed and the pulse became faster, making her ears buzz. For what?" she managed to say before moaning shamelessly. "For making fun of my lack of TDing skills." She couldn't hear anything more. His fingers moved faster and she could feel a familiar pressure building inside. Her nails dug at his shoulders and her breath became oddly shallow. Oh, she couldn't take much more. Her back was pressed hard against the wall, but she desperately held on to Naruto as he guided her through something only she had been able to accomplish on those nights of self-exploration. Hinata quivered, and Naruto watched her as she squeezed her eyes shut. Her mouth opened, trying to vocalize the sensation, and he couldn't believe how incredibly sexy she was. Her hips were moving hard against his hand, and he bit his lower lip, enthralled by her unconscious actions. He could feel the rush of his own blood in his ears and it took everything in him not to slip his fingers under those panties and thrust a finger up that slick, wet entrance. "Fuck, she's hot." "Naneru," she squealed and one of her hands pulled at his crooked collar, wrinkling it with her death grip. "Let it go, baby." He gritted his teeth. His own erection throbbed painfully as she bucked against him, and her nails dug deeper, her face progressively flushed with arousal. Then she felt it. There, at her core, a wave of pulses emanated from deep within her womb. The violence of the pleasure she felt nearly tore a scream from her, but Naruto had covered her mouth with his own, swallowing her into a brief and unwelcome silence. He had wanted to hear her scream, oh, sweet heaven, how he wanted to bask in her pleasure, but it would draw too much unwanted attention. They were still in his office, and he could clearly hear people speaking and walking about right outside his door. When she finally began descending from her high, he released her slowly, kissing her lips briefly before moving up to the bridge of her nose and nipping it. He smiled and she panted, her whole body shaking. She was at a loss for words. So, he pulled at something around his neck and she blinked in confusion. Weren't you supposed to help with this tie? Her head thumped against the wall again, and closed her eyes in disbelief. Hinata shook her head, blushing furiously at the memory. If anyone had told her a few weeks ago that something like this would happen if she ever decided to help Naruto with his tie, she would have outright dismissed their delusional theories. Unfortunately for her, Naruto was simply unpredictable, and right up to this moment, she was still trying to get a feel for him. What was worse, after that little adventure in the office, Hinata couldn't for the life of her remember a time where she'd been more unfocused in a meeting. Niji had frowned at her curiously more than once, Hanabi would occasionally giggle, and Naruto couldn't wipe the smug smirk off his face even if he tried. Hinata chewed the inside of her cheek pensively. The things he had made her feel in that office reminded her just how badly she wanted him. There were no excuses to be made at this point. She had to speak with him and find out for herself if they were ready. She stood from the bed and rolled her head gingerly, feeling the vertebrae snap once or twice. She was still tense, and definitely a little anxious, but it was nothing like it had been moments ago. Taking a deep breath and squaring her shoulders, Hinata walked towards the door and opened it. Good. Her hand was still intact. She stepped into the hallway, her fingers tugging irritably at the cheap panty elastic that dug into one of her butt cheeks. She looked down at her hands. The sleeves of the oversized dress shirt she had dug out of Naruto's closet earlier that night were sliding over them and she felt dwarfed inside of it. It was definitely forward of her, but it was all part of the plan. Hours before Ero Hinata and her insecure mini-me began their relentless tirade, Hinata had decided that she could catch his undivided attention with the little tidbit of information she discovered that day in his office. Indeed, that perverted boyfriend of hers had a thing for seeing her in business attire, and she would take advantage of that, especially tonight, but not without adding her own twist to it first. She had entered his room, sneakily, despite the fact that he was out, and put on a dress shirt that belonged to him. After several minutes of indulging herself with breathing in his scent, she dared to leave a few buttons open to reveal her abundant cleavage clad in her most revealing bra which, to her misfortune, still happened to be rather conservative. The buttoning down was a suggestion from her so-called support group, to which she still held a grudge against after the fiasco she had endured to get to this point. She could have had something sexier to wear under this, but after that informative lunch, she'd had to get creative. Earlier that afternoon, at Hanabi's persistent suggestion, she had made her way to a shady part of town she usually avoided. She had ditched Ko, her limo driver, to save face, of course, and borrowed Hanabi's car, which her younger sister eagerly exchanged for the limo. Hinata knew that her little sister's willingness to help her with transportation was mostly in support of her cause, but Hinata had the sneaking suspicion that mischievous little sister of hers just wanted a valid excuse to abuse Ko and have free rein on ordering him around. The directions provided to the virginal Hyuga were printed neatly on a yellow sticky note, thanks to Sakura. Hinata had been surprised the pink-haired woman was actually able to write between the sly looks and fits of giggles. It contained, besides the typical how-together instructions, a bonus of who and what to ask for, but Hinata had frozen into place when the store came into view and the note had instantly been crumbled in her fist. She no longer had any doubts about it, her love life had been far too sheltered and ignored. She couldn't believe such a store even existed. In the large display windows, there were items that made her turn beet red. She was blinded by the less than comfortable-looking corsets and as she tried to comfort her naivete, her gaze was marred by some complicated pieces of clothing she wasn't sure could actually cover her private bits. The worst part was that she couldn't figure out how she was supposed to get into the clothing, let alone have Naruto get her out of them quickly enough. Before she could finish asking herself if maybe the clothes came with a DVD instruction manual or a visual Hansen demonstration, she gasped in horror and spun immediately around. Her feet could barely keep up with the command to run, actually. The fluffy cuffs and the wall of dildos she had managed to overlook, but the catalyst was barely visible in the back of the store. Dear God, what the hell are those leather things? Whips? That was too much. Hyuga pride or not, the seductress boutique had defeated her. Even Ero Hinata was screaming at her to run and get the hell out of there. She fidgeted again, pushing the memory away. Despite it all, the length of the shirt was just perfect, ending just below her buttock. She liked how it fell against her curves, emphasizing her assets, and how it exposed her long legs freely. She knew it made the look sexy. She could do this. This could work. No, not could. Ero Hinata was quick to clarify. This will work. Hinata shook her head. The cold floor tickled her toes as her fingers wrapped themselves around the guest room's doorknob. Not wasting another second, she pushed the door open. The odd high-pitched creaks of the hinges made her wince, but were swallowed by the darkness of the hallway. Her feet slid across the floor, and her eyes focused on her goal. She could feel the anxiety run through her very veins, but she nonetheless propelled herself towards him with a deep, shuddering breath. Finally within his domain, Hinata couldn't suppress a cringe when she heard a quiet but very brief snore escape him. She paused. She could see him in the mixed shadows provided by the street light that flickered through the window, taunting her to come closer. Yet, she felt like a thief in her own home, hungry to steal his essence without making him aware of her intentions. Hinata then shook her head. Unlike what Ero Hinata had suggested, Hinata had no intentions of raping him. Can't rape the willing, the voice reminded, snickering. Hinata narrowed her eyes and ignored the voice. In fact, she wanted him to know exactly what she had in mind. The problem was she didn't know how to convey it without sounding like an idiot. That's why I keep saying to just take him. You want me to do this or not? Hinata hissed under her breath. No shit, Sherlock. What do you think? Okay, then do me a favor and pipe down, because you're not helping. Hinata shook her head, hoping to dislodge the voice from her head. She took a deep breath, and returned her gaze to the object of her desires. She had to suppress a giggle at the way he was sprawled like a starfish with his large feet sticking out from under the covers. Yet, despite the way he slept, she was inexplicably drawn to him with each breath he took. Her pale eyes watched him quietly, nervously, savoring the very sight of him. To her misfortune the floorboards beneath her squeaked as she moved, and he stirred awake. Hinata mentally facepalmed. Why was it that the day he brought her flowers it took everything in her to wake him up off the ottoman, but tonight he was the epitome of a light sleeper? She narrowed her eyes, eyeing him from her planted spot. Hinata's breath hitched as she admired his form molded by the shades of the night. She couldn't quite see him clearly, but the light caught his eyes and she was suddenly mesmerized by them. The blues shimmered and glowed like that of a cat in darkness. An intense feeling of dread washed over her, almost as if someone had dumped a very cold bucket of water on her when he turned on the lamp on the nightstand. A soft glow washed over the guest room. Crap. There was nowhere to hide now. What was she going to do? Now's your chance. Ero Hinata urged. Take him while he's confused. No. Knock him out and run for the hills. Mini-Me countered. Karateka him on the neck. If he asks about it in the morning, tell him it was just a bad dream. Hinata. Crap. She whimpered in despair. This was not sexy. This was not alluring. This was just Hinata Hyuga making a mess of things and reverting to complete idiot mode. She watched as he squinted away from the light and rubbed his eyes sleepily. He then looked at her with a curious frown. What are you doing here? His voice was still groggy, and he probably didn't realize how unbelievably profound that question was to her. Hinata resisted the urge to groan and gripped at the hem of his shirt. I don't know, she whispered. Liar. Naruto raised a bewildered brow. What? Two told you to knock him out. We need to talk. Oh. Naruto yawned, couldn't it have waited till morning? Hinata's shoulders sagged and she looked at her toes. He had a point. The man was dead tired and she wanted to talk. She felt selfish. Hinata. She raised her eyes to him apologetically. You're right. I can wait till tomorrow. I'm sorry. Retreating? Hinata frowned. She wasn't sure if that time it was one of her personas or just her own doubt calling her out. Naruto did a double take, albeit sleepily. He watched as she began making her way towards the exit. She had let go pretty easily, which made him a little bit curious. I'm awake, he assured, even if the raspy sound in his voice betrayed him. Hesitating, she looked at him again and stopped on her tracks. Come, he said, sitting up in the bed and gesturing her over with one hand. He was pretty certain that he'd never seen her so dejected before. Unsure and wide-eyed, Hinata remained near the door. Come on, he urged, scooting over and patting the spot next to him. Let's talk. He watched her hesitate for a few more seconds before she finally made her way to him. As she walked over, his eyes widened and he felt his face immediately heat up. Holy shit! What is she wearing? Once on the side of the bed, her long delicate fingers unconsciously reached out for him. One of his hands took the one she offered and the other, still somewhat sluggishly, raised the sheets for her to climb under. Her movements were cautious, and when she noticed his flushed features, she couldn't help but quiver slightly. No doubt he noticed her outfit, or to be more specific, her state of undress. Tell me what's wrong. His hushed voice rang through her, genuinely concerned, while he tried not to stare too much, but her nerves were too wired to answer him right away, so she chose to ignore the question and continue to brace herself, courage barely keeping her on her path. The thing is, she lingered off, she noticed the confusion settling on his handsome and sleepy features. Well. Maybe. I don't know. Naruto scratched his head slightly. You'll have to be a little bit more specific, love. Sleep makes me stupid. He yawned once again and stretched. She blushed when it struck her just how much of him was exposed to her. He was only in boxers and, although she could only see from his waist up, she could quite openly appreciate the way each muscle flexed and moved under his toned and golden skin. Sweet Jesus, she wanted to touch him. Hinata bit her lip, unsure what to say. Naruto noticed this and shifted on the bed until he was lying again. He pulled her down towards the pillow and she found herself face to face to him, lying on her side. Comfortable, now? He asked. She nodded softly. He smirked. He watched her sleepily, and his smirk turned into a soft smile. His scent on the pillow reassured her. Not only that, but he pushed away her insecurity with just one look, one smile. Naruto. Do you? She felt doubt creep in again and her mouth closed against her will. She frowned. She knew it was now or never, but she was still worried that her forwardness was going to backfire. She needed some form of encouragement, and since the heiress was missing in action once again, she did the next best thing, indulge herself. Her fingers slipped softly against his chest, like wind slithering amongst leaves in a tree. Naruto pressed his own fingers against her wandering ones and didn't say anything. She could feel his eyes on her, and she gulped. She knew her actions were attracting attention, but she didn't regret it one bit. How many times had she fantasized about touching him like this? She took a deep breath, determination firing through her, and she opened her mouth again. She would go through with this if it killed her. Is that my shirt? His fingers exploring the collar froze her into silence. Hinata stuttered, suddenly feeling vulnerable. She could see a smirk on his face, his index dipped past the material and onto her skin playfully while he waited for her answer. He grazed the collarbone and suddenly leaned up against an elbow. His face loomed above hers, dominating her into a strange lulled submission. She didn't resist when he began to pull the blanket away from her body. That is definitely my shirt. This time she swore she heard cockiness in his voice. The jig was up. Well, she stuttered again. He pulled the blanket back some more and she tugged back, suddenly fighting to keep her dignity. She could imagine Hinata groaning in disappointment in her head. Wasn't the whole point to show some skin? Why was she so embarrassed all of a sudden? He laughed and rolled his eyes, yanking the item from her fingers. Ha! It's about damn time someone put your plan into action. You damned deviant. Hinata thought. Hinata cackled. Me or Naruto hotness? Be both of you. Are you wearing anything under it? He teased, his hand slipping down to her thigh. Hinata froze when his fingertips touched the skin, interrupting her inner scolding. Ah. Ah. Her brain was defaulting and her breath had oddly caught in her throat. This wasn't supposed to happen. Why couldn't he just be a good sport and lay there and let her do the seducing? She was supposed to come on to him, not the other way around. In fact, she had been doing fine touching his chest, it had been a good start, but he just had to be quicker and better than her. You are such a virgin. Well, what could she do, though? She couldn't help turning into mush from just one single touch from him. This was all very new to her, and she still needed to learn a way to resist him, to set the pace. His hand traveled further up and Hinata gasped. The sound caught Naruto by surprise. It was more erotic than he anticipated and he cleared his throat. So you are wearing panties. Shame. His index followed the edge of the elastic and she squirmed under his touch. He noticed that the shirt was unbuttoned far too low, and he immediately felt a surge of blood heat in his body. His gaze hungrily wandered over her and Hinata felt exposed. You said you wanted to talk, he murmured, but desired otherwise, hoping it wasn't a serious conversation that required his attention. He could barely keep focused on anything other than her cleavage that was barely hidden by the hem of his shirt. Tenaciously, his hand dug under the elastic of her panties and wrapped around her hip. Naruto, she murmured. She still wanted to talk. He focused on her shoulder that was slowly slipping out of the open collar. Keep slipping. Almost there. Restraint wasn't on his list of priorities right then, he could see all her curves, no thanks to gravity. Hinata felt tongue-tied, how could she speak when he was still touching her? NGH. She couldn't even manage a word, let alone a sentence, when his thumb stroked her hip and the other fingers continued to map her skin under the material. She felt the goosebumps crawl up her back when he leaned in and kissed her shoulder tenderly. I wanted to. Another light kiss against her neck made forget for a second what she had wanted to say. Yeah. A flick of the tongue against the collarbone arched her back. He smirked. I wanted to ask if. His hand briefly emerged from within her panties only to grab the main elastic and begin pulling down. Naru, he silenced her by pressing himself to her and burying his face against her throat. His breath felt moist and hot against her neck and she moaned at the foreign sensation of his lips against her. God damn, she's hot. He nipped at her, basking in the taste of her skin. Her panties were already past her hips and reaching mid-thighs, whereupon Naruto abandoned them, his hands trailing back up to explore what had been hidden from his touch. She drew in a breath when his fingertips barely stroked her outer labia lips. Wait. She yelped suddenly, pushing at his chest. Naruto let her go, and shook his head slightly. He had crossed the line without realizing. Shit. I'm sorry, Hinata. Gasping for breath. Hinata rolled onto her back and closed her eyes. Don't be sorry, she whispered. Hinata. She rolled her head towards him and reopened her eyes, biting her lip when his gaze turned to avoid meeting with hers. Oh, for fuck's sake. Hinata screamed in her head. He was starting to do exactly what you came here to have him do to you. What's the excuse now? I'm supposed to control this. Not him, alright? Well, you're doing a shit poor job of it. Hinata pushed out the voice, irked that it felt the need to remind her she was failing at controlling the situation. Sorry, he apologized again. He felt like a lunkhead. Wasn't he the one that guaranteed her he would go at her pace, make sure she was comfortable with him? I'm such an asshole. He also rolled onto his back to give her space, but she rolled onto him this time, wrapping her arms around his chest and surprising him for a moment. And no, she said quietly. It's not your fault. She took a deep breath, blushing an embarrassing scarlet. I came in dressed like this, so I guess my plan worked a little too well. Your plan? He parroted, once again rolling onto his side and resting one hand on her hip. His other hand rested between them, fiddling with the hem of the shirt she wore as he eyed her curiously. What I came to talk about, she murmured. Yeah. About that, he mused out loud. You had already gone to bed by the time I arrived. Well, she began, it's a request, to be honest. He arched an eyebrow. I'm all ears. Tell him now. Hinata urged. Before you chicken out again. Hinata bit the corner of her lip softly. The thing is, I wanted to ask if you would be willing to amend a few things in our arrangement. Naruto blinked. She wanted to speak about the contract. Amendments? He was confused. She wakes me up, cock-blocks me, and then expects me to talk about this shit when I'm still nursing one hell of a boner? Yes, I wish to add a few things that would benefit both parties. Her face was now deeply buried against his chest, which was all the more a turn-on, and he wrapped one arm around her, forcing the young woman to lean against him while he propped himself up against the pillows. He looked at the crown of her head with a deeply frustrated frown that, for her sake, he tried to mask with confusion. He could literally hear his dick grumbling. This had better be good. You don't say, he muttered. But he couldn't help himself. He was a red-blooded, healthy male, and getting blue-balled was never fun. Hinata frowned slightly and pulled away from his chest to look into his eyes. Was that sarcasm she heard? Yes, she replied curtly, deciding it was. She did not appreciate that tone. So why the outfit, babe? He asked. This time the frustration was pretty evident in his voice. You don't need to bribe me like this to make contract changes, it's a garden. Plus, he tugged at her exposed bra strap, you have exclusive rights that most don't have access to. He tried to smile but he felt a little disappointed that she thought she had to do this to change something. Was he that hard to get along with? An expression of understanding dawned on the heiress. He wasn't trying to pick a fight with her, he was just confused as hell and didn't know what to make of her actions. She smiled at him, reaching up to caress his whiskered cheek. Not that arrangement, silly. He blinked at her. Well, I'm confused, then. Hinata giggled, and Naruto pouted. I mean it. I really don't know what you're talking about, he whined. Hinata sighed. This was a little difficult. Not only was her boyfriend as slow and thick as molasses, but she wasn't used to negotiating relationships. I want to. Amend our relationship terms. More blinking. Our what? How we're proceeding in our relationship. I wanted to ask. No. We need to add a few more incentives. He had to have misunderstood. He remained quiet for several seconds, processing her strange language. He wasn't sure how to react. Hinata eyed him expectantly. Several seconds went by before, finally, it dawned on him that his little vixen was trying to expand the limits of their relationship as if she was negotiating a contract. Oh. He wanted to laugh, she was too cute for her own good. Well, what kind of incentives were you thinking about? There was a change, she noted almost immediately when he pulled her tightly against him. Maybe he finally understood. I want more. The quantity of goods we had initially agreed upon no longer meets my demands. We must determine a new point of equilibrium and adjust the supply curve accordingly. Is that right? The urge to tease her at this point was almost astronomical, so he played along. Yes, that's right. Her tone was short. Hinata may have been inexperienced in relationships, but she knew when she was being picked on. But not the demand curve, right? Naruto almost snickered. Naturally, she deadpanned, not amused at all. Although I greatly value your services, you can't risk losing this contract. Oh, really? He smirked, arching an eyebrow in feigned surprise. Yes. So let me get this straight. You want to adjust the supply quantity because it no longer meets your demands. Precisely. Naruto frowned. Correct me if I'm wrong, but usually when demand exceeds supply, the price of said supply increases, meaning, the supply quantity stays the same and I get to charge more. Hinata smirked. That may be so, but since I know your inventory is practically endless, I'm not willing to pay more than is fair. You're a ruthless businesswoman, you know that. Her chin rose slightly, proudly. Hyugas are notorious for looking after their interests. I'm certainly not the exception. So I see, he muttered sarcastically. She inspected her nails carefully, just for dramatic effect. The amendments I'm willing to offer are in your best interests. I would think wisely before making a decision. This is a great opportunity for you, but a one-time offer only. Naruto laughed. You don't say. Hinata shrugged, unconcerned. Last time I checked you were the one who came here to talk to me. Your point. There was a moment of silence between them. Naruto shook his head slightly, impressed with her quick wit. You aren't giving me too many options. Hinata shrugged. That's because you hardly have room to negotiate. Your losses will be greater than mine. Oh, really? Yes, really. You are already deeply invested in this company, she reminded him offhand. Naruto narrowed his eyes. Regardless, shouldn't you be trying to convince me instead of trying to use these intimidation tactics? They are not intimidation tactics. I'm only looking out for you. That's some way to look out for me, he grumbled. Just stating the obvious. Yeah, okay. Naruto shook his head slightly. Not only are you ruthless, but you sure like to take your chances when striking up a deal. One must never fear at the sight of adversity. One must always take chances. Naruto snorted. Ahu. Chances, my ass. A loose cannon when giving someone your sales pitch, that's what you are and won't admit it. She smiled. Stop changing the subject. What will it be? What happens if I say no? Of course he wasn't going to, but he wanted to get a rise out of her, anyway. You go bankrupt. His eyes widened and he started sputtering nonsense. Why you cold-hearted woman, he accused. So much for getting a rise out of her. Hinata smiled smugly. She had him right where she wanted him. Naruto sighed in defeat. Very well, then. Tell me about these new conditions and amendments. Hinata took a deep breath. This was it. Tell me, he insisted. She braced herself, and finally spoke. I wish for us to further the boundaries of our physical relationship. Naruto laughed soundlessly. Boundaries. This was getting dangerously cute. Added to that, her tone throughout this conversation had been too serious so far, almost as if she was trying to decide exactly how many millions she wanted to invest on a new project, which only made him silently laugh harder. I'm being serious, Naruto. So am I, he said defensively, yet he couldn't suppress the wide grin on his face. Hinata eyed him suspiciously, not believing him. I'm serious, I promise, he swore. Was that a snort she heard? What commission percentage am I getting once we expand our relationship contract? You do know I can't do this for free, right? He tried to look his most composed, but the mirth and gleam in his eyes betrayed him. "Naruto," she warned. "You're the one who started it with all this business talk." He shrugged. She narrowed her eyes at him dangerously. He snickered. Okay. Humph. Is that why you're dressed like this?" He smirked, picturing her blush as she buried her face again. "Is this part of the negotiations?" He felt her nod, and this time he laughed outright. Hinata huffed, Berked he was taking her too lightly. "Babe, you didn't need to negotiate anything to convince me. All you had to do was ask." He kissed the top of her head and she mumbled something against his chest. He didn't hear it clearly, so he poked her. "What was that?" "Three want to make love," she stuttered, her face red as a tomato. Her confession surprised him, the force behind the nervous conviction preventing him from even doubting her seriousness. Then he burst out laughing. Hinata leaned back, watching him wide-eyed. "Naruto." He wouldn't stop laughing. Almost half a minute went by, filled with his laughter, and she was getting increasingly irritated, to the point she wanted to scream. When he finally started calming down, Hinata watched him expectantly, eyes narrowed with impatience. If she hadn't been lying down, her arms would have been crossed and she would have been tapping her foot. "Oh, my God," he heaved, still chuckling. "I'm glad I amuse you," she muttered sarcastically. Naruto took a deep breath, grinning at her beautifully. "Seriously, babe. I don't get you." Hinata only narrowed her eyes further. She thought she had been as straightforward as possible. What was there to not get? "I was well on my way to getting into your panties, but you stopped me, remember?" She still wanted to cross her arms, or turn away from him. This was getting embarrassing considering he was being quite logical. And she, quite irrational. "I know." Hinata grumbled, but it was going all wrong. What was going wrong? The plan. "I was supposed to be the one doing the seducing, not you." She poked him hard on the chest, and her unhappiness brazenly apparent with each jab. Naruto's eyes widened in surprise. He wasn't expecting that particular response, let alone the sound of voice laced with so much frustration. Hinata looked away, avoiding his gaze. "I wanted to be in control. But you're too intense. I turn to mush when you touch me, and I can't think straight." Naruto quirked an eyebrow. Since when was that a bad thing, he thought before taking her chin between his thumb and index. He caught her gaze and let his lips break into a very soft and reassuring smile. "You wanted to be in control, huh?" "Yes," she grumbled. "I thought we talked about this." He smirked. Hinata frowned slightly. "What do you mean? Isn't it better to lose control?" He rolled her over onto her back, slipped a thigh between her own and pressed her wrists up above her head. Her eyes widened in surprise when she felt his lips against her neck. His teeth nipped the ear lobe, catching her off guard. "You wanted me to just lay there like a dead fish?" he asked quietly against her ear while sneaking a finger inside her shirt, grazing the soft skin of her breast. "I." She blushed profusely. "Well, no." She took a deep breath. It's not like that." Another nip. At the shell of her ear, her eyes rolled back for a moment. "I'm pretty sure I made it clear to you that I wanted you to let go of your control freak tendencies." Hinata squirmed under him. His muscles flexed against her effort and she blew air out of her cheeks. "This isn't the same thing," she argued softly. "I'm not trying to control emotions, I'm trying to get the upper hand in seducing you." She tried to get her hands free, but he only pressed down harder, immobilizing her. "They're entirely different things." The words died in her throat when he distracted her with another lick, the heat of his body pressed against her as he leaned into her. "If you say so." He grinded against her slowly. She was a sinking ship and they both knew it. He was infuriating. "Let me make love to you," she hissed at him between slow thrusts. Naruto stopped his rocking and cocked an eyebrow. He'd have to be a fool to miss the emphasis on her words, but he loved teasing her, no matter under what circumstances. "Well," he began, "I'm afraid I can't make any promises on letting you have your way." Hinata frowned, confused, and a little miffed he wasn't willing to oblige this one request. He grinned mischievously, nuzzling her fringes. "However, I think that, tonight, that can certainly be arranged." Hinata blushed brightly, lightly exhaling. She couldn't stop the shy, yet triumphant smile that formed on her lips when he moved in with a loving smirk, but stopped short of kissing her, frowning slightly. "Is this really just a one-time offer?" he asked. The seriousness that laced his tone and the pout on his face was enough to make Hinata burst out laughing. He sighed in relief when she shook her head. He grinned and his lips finally met hers in a tender kiss. She didn't even mind when Hinata cackled in her head and said, "Hallelujah. I want to make love to you." Her exclamation still ringed in her ears. Why had she so vehemently made such a declaration? Now she was dumbfounded on what to do next. Should she just lean forward and kiss him? Or maybe caress him a bit? She had to resist shaking her head, lest she draw more attention than she already was. She felt like quite the fool. Every time she and Naruto had gotten hot and heavy, he had always led the way and she had always been more than glad to sit back and enjoy the ride. Now she found herself between a rock and a hard place. The whole thing was really ironic. Usually she was more cautious about the positions she placed herself in, but for once in her life, at least ever since she could remember, she found herself shooting first and asking questions later. Something in the back of her mind told her Naruto's influence had something to do with such out-of-character behavior. Nevertheless, she had wanted to control this, and now that he was ready and willing to oblige her, why did she have to pick the most complicated situation? The realization made her want to kick herself square in the ass. She had no experience in pleasuring a man, let alone enough to warrant setting such a high expectation for her first time with Naruto. Regardless, she wouldn't back out now. She looked into his eyes and averted her gaze just as quickly. She could feel her whole body unbearably heat up with nervousness. That look he was giving her. He was just lying there under her with this expectant look that practically screamed, "Come on, babe, dazzle me." Dazzle him? Ha! She was in way over her head. Everyone she talked to about the whole concept of lovemaking made it sound a little too simple, but now that she was in the particulars of the situation, she knew that it was all lies. How anyone managed to be this intimate with anyone else the first time in their lives boggled her mind. She pouted openly without realizing. "Who am I kidding? I can't do this. Maybe I should let him." Naruto noticed her silent struggle. It wasn't too hard to miss considering she hadn't moved in the 5 minutes since declaring she was going to rape him. So cute, he couldn't help to think as he watched her lower lips stick out slightly. Her eyes solely focused on her hands, as though she was trying to convince them to do something. Perhaps he could nudge her in the right direction, he decided, and reached out to her, his fingers brushing her cheek. The tenderness of his action brought unexpected comfort and silenced the butterflies in her belly. She closed her eyes for a moment, leaning into his touch, hoping that with that gesture he'd keep his hand there. However, once she shyly met his eyes, the restless butterflies resumed their anxious fluttering. Naruto didn't say anything, but the small loving smile that played on his lips told her almost everything that she needed to know. "It's all right." Hinata took in a slow, deep breath. He had accepted all of her strange behavior to date, there was no reason to worry about whether or not he realized she didn't have a clue on what she was doing. Actually, she was pretty sure he knew that, and the fact that he was still there with her was pretty significant. Naruto's gaze softened when Hinata smiled. All the while he had been watching her, her lips had been trembling and the shaking of her hands was noticeable, but as soon as he touched her, something had changed in her. She was still quite nervous, but now she seemed a little bit more at ease and more determined. Determined to do what she claimed she would do no matter what. Still, though, that didn't mean he couldn't help her relax a bit more if he could. He grasped her fingers with his own and brought her hand to his chest, pressing her palm against the middle of his torso. "Hinata," he whispered. Her eyes met with his. Her blush was burning the skin. "I'm just as nervous." Her eyes widened a fraction. Her head shook slightly and a small smile played on her lips. "That's hard to believe," she said playfully, but she could tell he wasn't lying. She could feel it under her touch, the excessive beating of his heart against his ribcage. "I'm serious." He pressed her hand harder, the beat was erratic. "Just anticipating your touch, your kisses. It always makes me nervous." You're always so calm," she whispered. Naruto took in a shaky breath instead, trying to calm a heart that refused to slow down. "I'm just very good at keeping a straight face." He tried to smile, but he decided to keep himself honest, and the smile that adorned his lips wasn't the confident, impish stretch that normally greeted her. For the first time, Hinata was exposed to his shy expression. He chuckled shyly when she brought her free hand to his lips. Her touch was that of a ghost on them. Despite his assurance that he was just as much of a wreck as she was, she envied the steady confident touch of his hand against her nervous one when he squeezed her hand again in encouragement. Why couldn't her own hands be like that? She wanted them to be like that. She held a frown in check and resisted the urge to stare her hands into submission. This wasn't the time to focus on everything that was going wrong, she needed to see the positives. And so, with that in mind, she leaned forward. She could see the slight parting of his lips in surprise at the unexpected movement, but she did not let that deter her. She bit her lower lip. Her momentum didn't slow down and her mouth timidly grasped his in a kiss. Yes. This was more like it. A small flicker of feminine pride swelled out of her insecurity when Naruto hummed in approval, breathing her in without reservation. Hinata's eyebrows perked up when she felt the rough stubble of his unshaven skin scratch the corner of her mouth as he twisted his head to delve further into the softness of her kiss. It was strange how, she thought, in just a few seconds, the awkwardness she had been struggling with so much turned out to be quite easy to break. Typical Naruto, she tenderly accused in her head before her tongue flicked out instinctively to moisten her lover's lips. She felt him smile before she deepened the kiss and tentatively explored his mouth. The tips of their tongues met, shyly greeting one another and extracting another hum from the blonde. Naruto's hand slid down from the nape of her neck and his fingers trailed gently down her jawline. Hinata shifted and his nails accidentally dragged against her sensitive skin. The feeling surprised her, goosebumps etching her flesh, and she arched against him as a result. He hissed, breaking the kiss as he sucked in a breath. The feel of her body pressed tightly against him made him tingle, and the curves of her breasts against his chest were tantalizing. "It's just a kiss, you dumbass, don't lose it," he chastised himself, but the thought was soon forgotten when Hinata's lips collided hungrily against his once more, demanding his full attention. He complied. His mouth explored hers quickly and her taste invaded his senses. She moaned into his mouth when his nails dragged again slowly, and the sensation set her skin on fire. Hinata's insecure thoughts drifted away with each sound he made. The heat of his skin lingered wherever she moved, it was a fleeting memory carved into her flesh. Her fingers grasped his when he cupped her cheek, and she tightened her grip on them, driving Naruto to want her more. Hinata, her name was a soft sigh on his lips. There was a promise in the words, she could feel it. His breath was hot against her neck, and his lips nipped and bit at her pulse point. She felt her toes curl when his tongue slid slowly down her neck. His rough chin chased it, and her skin couldn't decide if she ought to laugh or moan at the sensation. He shifted to lick her sensitive skin again, and she trembled in anticipation, biting her lower lip with a nervous energy that couldn't suppress the heat increasing between them. Her greed to monopolize him betrayed her. Her carefully controlled urges were breaking free, and she was willingly free falling into the depths of her lust. Her fingers slipped from his arm to his shoulder and without thinking, Naruto lifted his hips slightly, pressing himself against her sex. The sensation of his erection pressed against her elicited a small surprised gasp from Hinata, and her hands squeezed the flesh of his shoulders. He felt her dip her face at the crook of his neck and retaliated with a quick nibble there. He squeezed his eyes tightly, a groan slipped out when she licked the abused skin. The sound he made did something inside her. She didn't know what it was, but she wanted him to make more of them. She nibbled again, daring herself to explore him and drag her teeth across the collarbone. Naruto's lust flared even more. He was shocked to discover this was even possible when she abandoned his neck, pushed him back against the propped-up pillows and took a moment to watch him. She had to bite her lower lip to stop herself from grinning like the cat that swallowed the canary. She chastised for not trying this sooner. As a matter of fact, she had been right in her decision to lead the way in this. She really loved this unfamiliar, yet intoxicating sense of power. Who could have thought that having such a powerful man at her mercy, watching him desperately yearn for her touch, would instigate such a powerful arousal in both of them? What made the whole experience even more thrilling and exciting was that he was so utterly exposed and vulnerable to her will, and, given her insatiable greed for him, she was determined to take full advantage of this opportunity. So help her God, she wouldn't stop watching him. The way the light from the lamp spilled down on him, exposing every detail she had ever fantasized and dreamt about in the past few weeks, it was all making her dizzy. Her hand slipped down his chest slowly and she watched the goose bumps chase her touch before she slowed at his navel. Her index traced the tattoo there, she could feel the bumps of the old scars hidden under the ink. Her gaze met his, this time she didn't shy away. Naruto smirked. She tilted her head sideways a little, trying to figure out his expression. His cheeks were tinged with a flush and his hands were constantly touching something that was hers, her arms, her backside, until he finally settled on her thighs, gripping them softly to hold her in place as he pushed his erection again against her sex. She considered letting him take over for a split second. The sensations were quite pleasantly overwhelming, but she rejected that idea and instead rolled her hips to match his demand, letting out a small head deviously. Naruto raised a brow and did it again, and she shook her head slightly. She wouldn't give in. He, on the other hand, remembered his promise to her, and although he was very inclined to break it, he sighed, giving in. At least for the time being. Definitely. She definitely understood now why Naruto loved overpowering her so much in this kind of play. Letting her desire run amok was exhilarating. Is this for real? She frowned slightly. A part of her wanted to sit back and try to understand why she was acting this way. For a second, she became suddenly uncertain. She wondered if this was really happening or if it was a really powerful hallucination. If she were dreaming, she would be furious. As though to make sure, she reached down to his hand and squeezed the flesh there, nearly pinching him. Hey, now, not so hard. His hushed voice startled her. Hinata blushed fiercely once she realized she had acted out her own impulsion. This was definitely not a dream. I'm okay with some kinky stuff, but not. His words interrupted her inner monologue and her gaze met his, interrupting his amusement. Sorry, she apologized sheepishly. A sinful blush dusted her cheeks, the temptation to devour him was too powerful. Naruto, on the other hand, was swept up by the fierceness of her gaze. Her lust was dripping between them and he reacted immediately. His hands reached around the nape of her neck, pulling her down to his lips. He kissed her deeply, invading her mouth, and she met his fierceness with her own. Her breath caught when she felt the velvet of his tongue lick the exposed skin of her neck. A suck, then another lick traveled towards the dip of her pulse point. His teeth nibbled the length of her exposed flesh while the tip of his nose slid itself against her white ivory skin and met the buttoned edge of her shirt. He felt himself frown. Why was she still wearing it? Naruto took in a deep breath, ignoring the ludicrous thought that his own shirt was hellbent on cock-blocking him. She squirmed over him, snapping his attention back to her instantly. His mouth moved along her skin. Another taste, was all he could think of. She was selfishly having all the fun, and he unconsciously wanted a piece of the action. She felt hot under his touch and his tongue urged her response with another long and slow lick that teased the mounds of her breasts that one drew out a soft delicious moan from her lips. Naruto, stop. She pushed him away. Her skin was on fire, the blood rushing madly in her ears, and she had almost let him take over. Wah! He blinked, his brain was unusually slow, or to be more precise, too focused on regaining some control. I said I was doing this. She was breathing heavily. Was her body really pulsing from just that? Christ, she knew she wanted him, but to be this vulnerable against him? Oh, right. He shook his head slightly. His hand moved across his face, pinching the bridge of his nose. He was annoyed with himself for letting his urges take over. Shit. If she keeps this up. Hinata took advantage of his distraction, dipping her head towards his chest. There was nothing shy about her touch this time. Naruto could feel her fingers everywhere on him. She explored his arms, his sides, she grabbed his hips and her nose lingered over his navel. He hissed silently, the friction was unexpected and he arched his back slightly. Hinata did not notice, however. She was entirely focused on the task at hand. She shifted again, moving further down his legs. Naruto felt her breast slip down against his erection for a brief moment while she moved, and he closed his eyes tightly at the very thought. But then, she was still wearing far too much clothing for his liking. That shirt needs to go, pronto. He reached for it, his fingers searching for the buttons, but Hinata pushed his hand away, twice, before looking up. Naruto, she mumbled in warning, her mouth busy with trying to find a new sensitive spot on him. He huffed. He wanted to see her skin, to touch her. It was a serious crime to have her clothes deny him his right as a full-blooded male. Patience wasn't something he was known for, but all thoughts of retaliation were promptly dropped when he felt her move back up his torso and her teeth surrounded his right nipple. Hinata, was all he could manage before she tentatively bit down and let her tongue explore the nub. He stilled. Oh. The taste of his skin invaded her senses. She breathed him in and licked again, this time with a bit of more confidence, her curious nature forging on. She let the nipple go for a moment, her breath cooling the damp trail she left behind before her nose brushed against it. She tried to ignore the feel of Naruto's hands sliding up her back and the way his fingers were tangling in her hair at the base of her neck. She pulled at it between her lips. The tip of her tongue flicked across the rough skin, eliciting a groan from his lips. She had found it, the spot that gave her access to that low-tone, lust-filled voice. She nipped at him and suckled the skin below the nipple, ignoring his hands now pulling slightly at her hair. Her hands had slipped down to his navel, exploring the skin as her lips followed them. Her breath cooled the heat of his need and kept his thoughts scattered. Another groan escaped him and her mind whirled. It was hard to believe that she was making him feel this way, and it was unbelievably sexy. Her brows knitted together, unsure on what to do next, but it wasn't long before she quickly figured it out. Her index slipped across the elastic edge of his boxers. She quickly looked up and met Naruto's gaze, his eyebrows were raised slightly, as though he wasn't expecting her to be this forward. This will do. Her mouth opened and she quickly pressed her lips against his navel, sucking the skin softly. Her tongue twirled, her hair fell across his belly, and suddenly he could only feel what she was doing. Naruto stiffened suddenly, barely managing to tell his brain to push away the feel of her velvet tongue on him. What is she? He barely managed to finish the thought before he felt her hands hook onto the elastic of his boxers and pause long enough to gather her courage, and began pulling them down. Her eyes eagerly swallowed every detail she exposed slowly. Naruto could feel every breath coming from her, his stomach contracted, twitching in anticipation of what she was doing. She stopped once the first signs of blonde curls peered at her from the boxer line, her shyness instantly crawling back to the surface. This task seemed like too much bravado and she could sense a deep resentful frustration from deep within herself. Why was this so hard? Do you want me to? He asked, his voice thick with lust. No. She cursed her stutter. She hadn't spent all these weeks fantasizing about this particular part of his body only to deny herself the chance of a lifetime because of a little embarrassment. She pulled down, quickly, and she was rewarded with something even more beautiful than she had anticipated. Her gaze eagerly drank every detail. He was large. She bit her lower lip but she couldn't decide if her feeling was anticipation or apprehension. Her cheeks warmed at the thought of touching him. Its anticipation, definitively. She decided that it was time she acted on her impulses and did just that. Her index reached out and slid down the length tentatively. It barely brushed the skin, but she could tell by Naruto's barely quiet gasp that it was very sensitive. That, and the fact that it kept twitching more eagerly the more she explored. She wiggled further down on his thighs, her eyes never leaving her new favorite body part. Once she settled, she touched the tip curiously. Her fingers wrapped gently around the shaft, wanting to grasp his size. His arousal was hot under her touch. It had a sweet, musky smell she couldn't seem to get enough of. She brought her face closer to him, her hand slipping down. She heard Naruto grunt and watched his hands grip the sheet next to his hips. Shit. He cursed in his head. As a matter of fact, he was having trouble keeping his thoughts clear. This is going to be a short display of manliness. Hinata, however, was completely oblivious to his struggle. She narrowed her eyes a moment, discussing her level of bravery when Hinata decided to give her a little push. She licked the tip. Naruto, for all it was worth, simply lost his mind at that instant. He hadn't expected her to do that. And, well, if that was what she had in mind, then there was no way he was going to last, let alone keep his promise. But then again, how bad could it be if he thoroughly distracted her from that little fact? She was probably going to be mad about it for a bit, but it would be worth it for sure. It's her own fault, he justified to himself. It was taking everything in him to not flip her over onto her back and teach her what all this touching was doing to him. She cupped his balls suddenly, and without warning, he let out a guttural growl. That's it, he thought. She's had it coming for a while now. Hinata looked up at him, surprised to hear him make such a sound. His face was flushed, his eyes almost molten with desire. There was something dangerous in this particular situation that had suddenly set her ablaze. His hands took her by her arms, pulled her up, and flipped her on her back in one swift motion. Naruto, I'm the one that's supposed to dash, she protested, but he wouldn't hear any of it. I can't hold back anymore, he interrupted almost desperately against her neck, sucking the flesh without mercy. There was a sudden violent tug on the shirt she wore, and the buttons popped and shot across the bed. Once the shirt lay open, exposing her breasts, Naruto pushed the offending material off her. Finally, he exclaimed with such a finality that she merely blinked in surprise. Her bra met a similar fate. The clasp snapped apart in his urgency to strip her once and for all. Hinata cried out when his index and thumb found her nipple and pinched her. He ground against her and a slow mesmerizing groan escaped him again before cursing out her panties. Why are you still wearing these? He quickly grabbed them, pulled them off without much of a pause before smothering her confusion with a kiss that made her toes curl. He slipped a hand between her legs, fingers easily gliding between the slick folds of her labia, and the palm of his hand pressing hard against her clit. Her eyes snapped open when he pushed 2 fingers inside her. His invasion was sudden but she welcomed it. It wasn't the first time he'd entered her this way. She met its intensity and gasped into his mouth when she felt his palm moving erratically against her clit. Her hand gripped his elbow, hanging on for dear life, knowing full well how effective those fingers were at extracting such delicate sensations from her. She moaned, squirmed and squealed under his touch, but he was relentless. She broke the kiss. Her hips were twitching every time he pressed against her sensitive nub. Don't. she tried to finish her sentence, but he shifted his weight between her legs and felt the wet tip of his erection rub against her thigh. Naruto let out a groan at the feel of it, his voice was hoarse and strangely erotic and she fell further away from coherence. Fuck. He could barely focus. He moved away from her face, his lips devouring everything in its path. He nipped the top of her breasts, there was nothing gentle about it. She let out a small blissful cry when his lips pinched down on her nipple and his tongue flicked slowly against the pink swollen flesh. Another high-pitched squeal escaped his lover's mouth when he entered her with a third finger, her vaginal walls squeezed instinctively against the intrusion. Oh God! Naruto looked up as he continued his slow assault on his lover's breasts. He could see Hinata's eyes tightly shut, her brows unable to decide if they wanted to frown or raise high under her bangs. Her cheeks were burning with a blush that screamed her pleasure. Without thought, he dipped his head and nipped at the bone of her collar, licking the skin at the pulse point, and worked his way up. Ah! Hinata's low moan came when she felt his fingers slipped out of her folds and found the hood of her clit. They moved in circles she couldn't follow, couldn't anticipate, and the build in the pit of her stomach was reaching a breaking point. Slow down, babe, he hissed between clenched teeth, but her rocking movement was rubbing against his erection and making it very difficult to slow them down and try to subdue her unconscious humping of his hand. The irony of him telling her to slow down wasn't lost on Naruto, but this was spiraling out of control quickly. He didn't want to fuck her like an animal, he wanted to love her. Hinata tried to listen, she really did, but she was lost on the feeling that was pulsing through her. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears, her breath was heaving as her heels dug into the back of his thighs. It wasn't enough to just touch him, to kiss and taste him, she wanted him inside her, deep within her to satisfy this thirst, this lust that was completely controlling her. Damn! Naruto felt his eyes roll backwards. Her pussy was making a wet smacking sound as she tried to hump his hand faster, and the realization that she was completely turned on made his balls tighten. Hinata's back arched almost violently when he twisted his fingers on her clit, her thighs shook as she squeezed them together to control the tremor that was building, but Naruto's torso was in the way. She squirmed, her hands squeezed on his shoulders and pushed them up at the same time. Naru, her voice was husky, heavy with lust. It made Naruto's head spin. It wasn't rocket science, he knew what she wanted without her even having to say anything. Naruto settled between her legs, his lips hungry for another kiss. He slipped his tongue deep, possessing her mouth. He pushed her legs further apart with his knees and broke the harsh kiss that had swollen her lips in its intensity. The tip of his cock hit her slick entrance and Hinata froze at the sensation. This was it, this is what she had been waiting for. From all her experience with him and the constant teases over several weeks, it was no secret that his fingers had only created this strange endless void that needed to be filled with him. She could feel the tip sliding in slowly, carefully. Her hands folded behind his neck, pulling him down towards her, but he was resisting her, concentrating on getting her used to him. Too slow. Much too slow, she was far too impatient. She could almost hear Hinata cackling in the back of her mind. Hinata sucked in a breath as he filled her, stretching around his shaft. He kissed her lips, whispered her name between nibbles and licks on her neck to her to distract her before sliding in suddenly to the tilt. She gasped loudly, her fingers dug at his neck and she stilled. It didn't hurt, and that surprised her, for she had expected it to. In fact, she read that it would. Naruto watched her expression. He wasn't sure if she was okay. Her eyes were closed, a frown was quite evident, but she did not move. Are you okay? Naruto nuzzled her nose and kissed the tip before she opened her eyes and blinked. Yais, she stuttered. Naruto smirked at the sight that was under him, she was unbelievably sexy. He leaned forward, nipping her ear. You're beautiful, he whispered, surprising his lover before he pulled back slightly, moving inside her. Her breath hitched and Naruto bit his lip before dropping his forehead against the pillow behind her. You feel so good, Hinata," he mumbled against the crook of her neck. He pushed forward in a slow, torturous thrust. He hissed when she let out a moan. His slow thrust sped Hinata's heartbeat, and her hand slid down from his neck to his back. Her fingers pinched him impatiently. He squeezed his eyes shut as his cock twitched inside her. Her hand slid over his backside, pushing him in deeper. Naruto snapped his head up from the crook of her neck as she gasped, her eyes meeting his in surprise. There, that was the spot she had been seeking. He raised a brow, smirking as Hinata's expression melted into one of bliss. Her hips rolled under him, catching him off guard. He began to pump his hips, loving the way he could feel Hinata's breasts rubbing against his chest. Hinata pressed her fingers on his rear more firmly, her hips meeting his every thrust. This wasn't going well, he had already forgotten to take his time, but such was life. He sped up, a hand slipped under her but to bring her even closer to him. Naruto groaned, her slick pussy was swallowing him in deeper. He was barely holding on. Hinata suddenly hissed, her hands released his ass and her fingers dragged across the muscles harshly. He could feel the skin of his back aching, but it only brought him closer to losing his careful control. Ah! Naruto arched his back. Goosebumps trailed her touch and his skin felt like it was on fire. "Stop doing that," he warned her, frowning. She ignored him, dragging her nails again. Apparently Naruto had a thing for nails on his back and this made her smirk. He sucked in a breath and momentarily lost control, thrusting hard and fast. Hinata's voice suddenly became loud, knocking him back into reality. His hips bucked, slowing to a crawl. "Stop," he stuttered at her. Hinata blinked, her eyes meeting his for a moment. "We have to do this slow, or else I'm not going to be able to dash," she kissed his mouth shut. The feel of him sliding inside her was addicting and she wanted it all in again. The pulse was getting stronger every second. Naruto grunted, his hands squeezed her hips tightly and he pushed harder into her, suddenly filling her to the tilt once more. Hinata gasped. Her belly was pooling with a sensation she was familiar with, but it felt different at the same time. He began moving faster and her legs moved from his thighs to his hips, her fingers moving to his back to pull him closer. Naruto openly moaned this time. Hinata's panting was back, her eyes were tightly shut and she was consumed with the feeling he was building within her. She couldn't stop the sound coming out of her mouth no matter how embarrassing it was, and it only encouraged Naruto to thrust harder. He grabbed her ass, fingers digging in her flesh. Sweat began sliding down his nose. "God damn, this is going too fast," he thought, but before he could slow down, Hinata suddenly wrapped her arms around his neck again, and in a broken voice whispered to him, "Oh. Oh. Naruto, right. Right. Ah." He couldn't slow down at this point, and Hinata couldn't keep the feeling away anymore. Her hips moved even harder against Naruto, following his lead. The pulse was peaking. She heard him whispering something in her ear, but it was lost to her, she couldn't think anymore. There was an explosion of white behind her eyelids. Her belly tightened, her thighs were shaking and her throat felt suddenly raw. Her walls squeezed down on Naruto's shaft as he moved hard inside her, his own groans and moans mixing in with hers. She was barely descending from her climax when she felt Naruto's body tense. His face buried against her neck as he slammed into her quickly until he finally stopped. He groaned deeply and collapsed on top of her, their heaving breaths mixing together. He then leaned his forehead against hers, their eyes meeting once again before Naruto smiled sheepishly. Hinata grinned. "You broke your promise," she accused breathlessly. "True," he blew out a breath slowly, trying to slow down his heartbeat, "but you were being a horrible tease." He kissed her again, this time softly. His fingers found hers and tightly wound themselves together. "Hinata," he spoke with heaving breath still, but it was difficult to sound calm when your body felt like it was on fire. Her fingers were traveling up and down his back, basking in the afterglow. "I love you." The heiress blinked, stunned by his revelation. She stuttered. Naruto grinned, enjoying this side of his lover. She was never one to be at a loss of words, but here she was, completely dumbfounded. He kissed her again. Her shock barely subsided before he distracted her with his very nimble fingers on her body. Needless to say, the silent vibration of Naruto's cell was completely missed.
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.